In this video, we're going to be going through my final 53-man roster projection for the Titans and evaluating each position group as we head into the season. When it comes to who actually makes the roster, this is what I think is going to happen, but as far as the ordering of the depth chart, it's just based on my evaluation of the players. And to make things more interesting, I've given each player a 0 to 10 rating based on how I view them for this season, so nothing to do with potential. 10 is an elite top 2 player at their position, 5 is an average starter, and 0 is someone that shouldn't be on an NFL roster. So I've got all 3 quarterbacks making the roster. The big question here is obviously quarterback 2, Malik Willis versus Will Levis, and honestly, I haven't seen enough of Will Levis to make a firm evaluation. I think Levis has more long-term upside, so if Tannehill got injured, I would be tempted to put him in just to get him those reps. But looking at it purely from a win-now perspective, I would give Malik Willis the slight edge. I've also got 3 running backs making the roster. I think Tyjae Spears is pretty clearly going to be the best backup that Derrick Henry's ever had in his career. And then I went with Julius Chestnut over Hassan Haskins. Haskins was really a UDFA type of talent. He's a utility back who can pass block. He doesn't drop passes. He doesn't fumble the ball, but he doesn't create much after contact. He isn't really elusive in the open field. Wide receivers where it gets interesting. Obviously, you love the top 2 with DeAndre Hopkins and Treylon Burks, but unfortunately, it's not looking great for Kyle Phillips. He tore his MCL in the second preseason game, so he'll be out about 6 weeks. And I still really like him as a player, but I'm not going to be making any more pro Kyle Phillips comments until I see him healthy for a full season. And as far as the final 53 roster spot, I think what's going to happen is he'll make the final 53, but then they move him to IR like a day later. So these would be my 6 receivers with Kyle Phillips on IR. Chris Moore is an uninspiring wide receiver 4. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, as an Indiana fan, I'm happy that he's been able to stick around, but he really shouldn't be playing meaningful snaps for an NFL offense. But with that being said, I do think Moore and NWI are a step above the rest of the receivers they have on the roster. For the 5th spot, I went with Reggie Roberson. The Titans don't really have any vertical element to their passing game outside of Treylon Burks, and he's a player that probably would have been drafted if he didn't have the ACL tear, so there is some potential that he could be a quality deep threat. And then the 6th spot goes to Colton Dowell, who's had a slow start, but probably the most upside of anyone else they have. And then this is how I would order the rest of the receivers. Kearis Jackson is one player where I just don't really understand the hype. I went with 4 tight ends, Chig Okonkwo, Trevon Wesco, Thomas Odukoya, and Josh Wiley. If I were making the decision, I'd actually have Kevin Rader over Trevon Wesco. They're both blocking tight ends that give you nothing in the receiving game, but Kevin Rader's younger, and I think he's a much better run blocker, at least as far as what he's put on tape. Wesco seems to have a high reputation as a run blocker, but going back to his New York tape, I wasn't really that impressed. Odukoya is another pure blocking specialist. He's almost closer to a 6th offensive lineman, and watching him in the preseason, he was definitely the Titans' best run blocking tight end. And Josh Wiley was probably my least favorite pick from this class. I haven't been impressed by him in the preseason, but theoretically, he has the potential to be a wide tight end that can block and catch, which isn't something the Titans really have anywhere else. Moving on to the O-line, I'm cautiously optimistic on Andre Dillard. He shut down all the backups that he's faced in the preseason. I don't think he's going to be a great run blocker, but if you're higher on the Titans O-line than the consensus, I think the main inflection point is going to be the upgrade from Dennis Daly to Andre Dillard. NPF I have on here for the graphic, but he actually isn't going to count against the final 53 since he's suspended. And for the first 6 weeks, it looks like Chris Hubbard is going to be the starting right tackle. These first 2 preseason games are the only time I've ever watched Chris Hubbard, so I don't really know that much about his game. But just based on a limited sample size of snaps, I'd probably put him somewhere in between Dennis Daly and Dennis Kelly. And then John Ojukwu was my favorite UDFA the Titans added. They gave him a $190K signing bonus, which was the highest in their class, and I think he has long-term upside to be a quality starter. On the interior, left to right, you've got Peter Skoronski, Aaron Brewer, and Daniel Brunskill. Aaron Brewer kind of is what he is at this point. He's a plus run blocker, but definitely a weakness in pass pro. He actually has pretty good technique. He's got quick hands, long arms, but he just gets overwhelmed when he's matched up with elite power rushers. And Daniel Brunskill is best suited, I think, as a 6th offensive lineman. He's a smart player and he has positional versatility, but he's so limited athletically. Corey Levin is good depth at center. I think he's a safe bet to make the roster. And the veteran Justin Murray has been the most impressive backup offensive lineman so far in the preseason. Moving to the defense, I've got 6 edge defenders making the roster. They've got a really exciting trio with Danico Autry, Harold Landry, and Arden Key. And then Rashad Weaver, I think, has a limited ceiling, but he's great as your 4th edge defender. Sam O isn't going to give you much rushing the passer, but he was solid last year in a reserve role. And Caleb Murphy, the undrafted free agent out of Ferris State, I think you've got to keep on the roster. He doesn't have elite athletic traits, but he's a high motor player with a polished set of pass rushing moves. I've got 4 defensive linemen making the roster. Jeffrey Simmons and Tier Tart is as good as it gets for a starting 2. I've seen some people say the Titans have a lot of defensive line depth. I've got to firmly disagree with that. Jaden Peavy I have on the roster based on the reports that he's been good in training camp, but when you watch him in the games, he gets moved back so easily, so he's got to improve his anchor before I would put him on the field. And I've actually got Naquan Jones ahead of him based off experience. Linebacker is the most interesting and least consequential position battle, I think. It might just be time to stop trying to make Monty Rice happen. He clearly seems to be in the coach's doghouse, and he's another player that just can't stay healthy. Just based on game film, I still think he's objectively the Titans' second best linebacker, but if he's not going to be a starter, my pick would be Chance Campbell, who's actually a very similar player, and you could make the argument that Campbell has more upside in pass coverage. He had a really good man coverage rep on a running back from the first preseason game. I'll put that on the screen. He's probably more athletic than Monty Rice, and they both have the same issue of being smaller linebackers with short arms, so it's just pretty hard for them to shed blocks. Luke Gifford I have on as a special teamer. He's been solid in the preseason, and Mike Vrabel really seems to like Jack Gibbens. I'm sure he answers all of his questions in meetings, but I was actually closer to cutting him than having him as a starter. If you watch him try to chase someone down or just run in a straight line, the speed is a major issue for Jack Gibbens. And I said this position battle was the least consequential because I think if you have a great defensive line, the linebacker play isn't as important. And you've seen that play out over the last decade of Titans football. They've always had a really good 3 technique dating back to Jarrell Casey. And you look at pretty much every linebacker that they've played outside of Rashaan Evans, they've been solid at the worst. So the types of linebackers the Titans need are the top 3 players I have listed. All 3 of them are instinctive, they've got straight line speed, and they're good tacklers. Being undersized and struggling to shed blocks doesn't really matter if the defensive line's constantly occupying double teams and preventing them from climbing to the second level. So I'd be good with any of the top 3 starting, but if Jack Gibbens is playing meaningful snaps, I really worry about his limitations in coverage. The cornerback room is really solid. Christian Fulton, pretty much the only thing I worry about is his hamstrings. I do think Roger McCreary needs to take a step forward this season. His rookie year was kind of rough, but you understand it because he's a rookie. He was a borderline liability in off coverage, which is a major issue because the Titans run so much quarters. Sean Murphy-Bunting is a major X factor. I'm not entirely sure what to expect. He was great last year in man coverage, but he just had so many coverage busts. So I think the top 3 is really solid, but if Sean Murphy-Bunting ends up being a steal, this could be a great cornerback room. And I also really like the cornerback for Trey Avery. I think at worst he's going to be solid depth, but he actually has starter upside. The biggest thing for him is going to be maintaining his level of play against elite competition. I'll put a table up on the screen, but if you split his targets last year based on the receiver, he was an elite corner statistically when he was facing the Trent Irwins of the world, but when he was matched up with an elite wide receiver 1, his technique fell apart and he kind of got bodied at the catch point. So that's the main thing I'm going to be looking for with Trey Avery this year. And then Eric Garror gets my last cornerback spot. He's a really aggressive run defender, plays with a lot of confidence, but he isn't very sticky in coverage. Final position group on defense is safety. Obviously Kevin Byard and Amani Hooker are going to make the roster. Elijah Molden's making the transition over from the slot. I actually think this is a more natural position fit for him. And then I've got Tyreek Jones and Mike Brown also making the final 53. When I was watching Boise State's defense, I started with a few 2021 games, and JL Skinner was the main safety that was getting a lot of draft hype, but from the 2021 film, I actually came away from it more impressed with Tyreek Jones. Then when you get to 2022, his play kind of fell off a cliff. He was an awful tackler last season. He's actually one of only 2 players the Titans added in this draft class with above 50th percentile arm length for their position. He made a nice play in cover 2 against the Vikings, but I haven't heard much about him in training camp, so this is really just based off my pre-draft evaluation. And then Mike Brown is kind of a hybrid safety linebacker, limited speed, but I think he can add some value in run defense. And finally, we've got special teams. I've got Mike Badgley here as the kicker. I'm recording this on Wednesday, August 23rd, and it wouldn't surprise me if he gets cut by the time this video's out. The Titans signed him after cutting Caleb Shudak and Trey Wolf, and then he missed 4 kicks in practice, and Mike Vrabel's comments on him did not inspire much confidence. And if O-line doesn't end up being this team's biggest weakness, I think it's going to be kicker. And then at punter, you've got Ryan Stonehouse, who was great as a rookie, and Morgan Cox. I don't think I've ever watched him individually for a single snap, but I haven't noticed any problems, so I gave him a 7.5. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy the video, make sure to like and subscribe. Also, let me know in the comments any NFL players or teams that you'd like me to cover.